The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Windsor Castle as King Charles III sat alone in his private study, staring at the handwritten letter that had arrived just hours before. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he read the contents for the third time, each word hitting him like a physical blow. The letter bore the seal of a private investigator he had secretly hired months ago, and the revelations contained within threatened to shake the very foundations of the British monarchy. Charles had always suspected there were secrets buried deep within the royal family's past, but nothing could have prepared him for this discovery. The investigation had been prompted by a series of anonymous letters he had received, each one hinting at a scandal involving his late mother, Queen Elizabeth II, during the early years of her reign. Initially, he had dismissed them as the work of conspiracy theorists or attention seekers, but the persistent nature of the correspondence and the specific details mentioned had eventually worn down his resolve. The private investigator, a discreet man named James Morrison with 30 years of experience handling sensitive cases for wealthy clients, had uncovered evidence that suggested Queen Elizabeth had secretly given birth to a child in 1954, 2 years after Charles himself was born. According to the documents Morrison had obtained from sealed archives and testimonies from former palace staff who had agreed to speak under strict confidentiality agreements, the child had been immediately given up for adoption to protect the monarchy from scandal. What made this revelation even more shocking was the identity of the child's father. The investigation suggested that the Queen had engaged in a brief but passionate affair with a prominent American diplomat during a state visit to the United States in 1953. The relationship had been carefully concealed from the public and even from most members of the royal household, but it had resulted in a pregnancy that could have destroyed the monarchy's reputation and the Queen's marriage to Prince Philip. As Charles absorbed this information, his mind raced with the implications. If the story were true, it meant he had a half-sibling somewhere in the world who had no knowledge of their royal heritage. More troubling still, it meant that his beloved mother, whom he had always viewed as the epitome of duty and moral rectitude, had harbored this enormous secret for her entire reign. The weight of this knowledge felt crushing, and Charles found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about his family and the institution he now led. The investigation had also uncovered evidence suggesting that several high-ranking members of the royal household at the time had been aware of the situation and had worked together to orchestrate an elaborate cover-up. Medical records had been falsified, palace staff had been sworn to secrecy with generous financial incentives, and the child had been placed with a carefully selected American family who believed they were adopting an orphan from London. Charles stood up from his desk and walked to the window, gazing out at the grounds where he had played as a child, where his mother had walked her beloved corgis, where generations of his family had lived and ruled. The peaceful scene before him seemed almost mocking in light of what he had just learned. How could such a tranquil place have been the setting for such deception and heartbreak? The king's thoughts turned to his daughter-in-law, Catherine. As the Princess of Wales, she had shown remarkable grace and dedication to her royal duties, despite the intense scrutiny and pressure that came with her position. Charles had grown genuinely fond of Kate, admiring her strength and the stability she brought to William's life and to the younger generation of royals. But he also knew that this revelation would affect her deeply, as it would call into question the very nature of the family she had married into. Charles had always prided himself on being more open and transparent than previous monarchs, believing that the royal family needed to modernize and become more relatable to the British people. He had spoken publicly about his struggles with his parents, his failed marriage to Diana, and his journey to find love with Camilla. But this secret was different. This was not his story to tell, and yet he felt the burden of carrying it alone was becoming unbearable. The private investigator had warned Charles that others might also be pursuing this story. Journalists, historians, and even foreign intelligence services were constantly looking for scandals involving the British royal family. If this information fell into the wrong hands, it could be weaponized against the monarchy or used for blackmail. Charles realized that he might need to make a preemptive move to control the narrative before someone else exposed the truth. As he contemplated his options, Charles thought about the potential consequences of revealing this secret. The British public had endured years of royal scandals, from his own divorce and remarriage to the troubles faced by his siblings. Would they be able to forgive yet another revelation of royal impropriety, even one that had occurred 70 years ago? Would it damage the monarchy's reputation irreparably? Or would people understand that even queens were human and capable of making mistakes? The king also considered the impact on the unknown half-sibling, who would now be nearly 70 years old and likely living a completely ordinary life somewhere in America. Did this person have the right to know their true parentage? Did they have children and grandchildren who deserved to know they were descended from British royalty? Or would revealing the truth only cause pain and disruption to innocent people who had built their lives on what they believed to be their true family history? Charles returned to his desk and picked up his phone, his finger hovering over Catherine's number. He knew he needed to confide in someone, and Kate had proven herself to be both trustworthy and wise beyond her years. She had navigated the treacherous waters of royal life with remarkable skill, and her perspective as someone who had married into the family rather than being born into it might provide valuable insight into how the public might react to this revelation. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier than it did in that moment, as Charles prepared to share a secret that could change everything. Catherine, Princess of Wales, was in the middle of reviewing plans for her upcoming early childhood development initiative when her private secretary knocked gently on the door of her study at Kensington Palace. The afternoon had been productive, filled with meetings about charitable work that had become her passion since joining the royal family. She looked up from her notes, expecting to hear about a schedule change or media request, but instead was told that His Majesty had requested an urgent private meeting at Windsor Castle. The drive to Windsor gave Catherine time to wonder what could be so pressing that Charles needed to see her immediately. Their relationship had grown stronger over the years, built on mutual respect and their shared commitment to the monarchy's future. Charles had been particularly supportive during her difficult periods, including her recent health challenges, and she had come to value his guidance and wisdom. However, urgent summons were unusual, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was about to unfold. Upon arriving at Windsor Castle, Catherine was escorted directly to the king's private study, bypassing the usual formal protocols. She immediately noticed Charles's demeanor. He appeared aged beyond his years, with deep lines of worry etched across his face. His usual composed bearing seemed fragile, as if he were carrying an enormous burden that threatened to overwhelm him. The sight of him in such obvious distress immediately put Catherine on high alert. Charles gestured for her to sit in the chair across from his desk, and for several moments, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched uncomfortably as the king seemed to struggle with where to begin. Catherine had learned during her years in the royal family that patience was often the best approach when dealing with sensitive matters. So she waited quietly, offering him an encouraging smile that conveyed her willingness to listen without judgment. When Charles finally began to speak, his voice was barely above a whisper. He told Catherine about the anonymous letters, the private investigation, and the shocking discoveries about Queen Elizabeth II's hidden past. As he revealed each detail, Catherine felt her world shifting beneath her feet. The grandmother-in-law she had known and respected, the woman who had guided her through the early years of royal life with kindness and wisdom, had harbored a secret of unimaginable magnitude. Catherine's initial reaction was disbelief. The Queen Elizabeth she had known was the embodiment of duty and propriety, a woman who had dedicated her entire life to service and had never put a foot wrong in public. The idea that she had engaged in an extramarital affair and given birth to a secret child seemed incompatible with everything Catherine thought she knew about her. Yet as Charles continued to share the evidence uncovered by the investigation, the pieces began to form a coherent, if shocking, picture. The Princess of Wales found herself thinking about her own experiences as a young woman thrust into the spotlight of royal life. She remembered the overwhelming pressure, the constant scrutiny, and the feeling of being isolated from the normal world she had known before. If she, with all the support and preparation available in the modern era, had found the transition challenging, what must it have been like for a young Queen Elizabeth in the 1950s, when expectations for royal behavior were even more rigid and unforgiving? Catherine began to understand how a brief escape into romance might have seemed like a lifeline to a young woman trapped in a gilded cage. The Queen would have been only 27 at the time, Married young to a man chosen as much for political reasons as personal ones, and bearing the enormous responsibility of leading a nation still recovering from World War II. In that context, a moment of human weakness and genuine connection might have felt like a precious taste of the normal life she would never be allowed to live. As Charles finished his account, Catherine realized that her response would be crucial not only for the king's peace of mind, but potentially for the future of the monarchy itself. She could see that he was looking to her for guidance, perhaps because her outsider's perspective might help him understand how the British people would react to such a revelation. The weight of that responsibility felt enormous, but she also recognized that this was exactly the kind of moment that defined what it meant to be a working member of the royal family. Catherine's mind immediately went to William and their children. How would William react to learning that his beloved grandmother had kept such a monumental secret? How would they explain to George, Charlotte, and Louis that their great-grandmother, whom they remembered with such fondness, had lived a life far more complicated than anyone had imagined? The ripple effects of this revelation would touch every member of their family, and Catherine felt a protective instinct rising as she considered how to shield her children from the potential fallout. She also thought about the practical implications of the discovery. If the story became public, it would dominate headlines around the world for months or even years. Every detail would be dissected, every piece of evidence would be scrutinized, and the royal family would face intense questioning about what they knew and when they knew it. The media would hunt for the secret half-sibling, turning their life upside down in the process. The very stability that the monarchy represented could be called into question. Yet Catherine also recognized that there might be an opportunity hidden within this crisis. The royal family had been working for years to modernize its image and become more relatable to ordinary people. Perhaps acknowledging that even the most revered monarch was human, capable of love and mistakes and difficult choices, might actually strengthen the connection between the royal family and the public. People might respect the honesty and find it refreshing after decades of perceived stuffiness and distance. Catherine asked Charles whether he had considered trying to locate the half-sibling before making any decisions about disclosure. She pointed out that this person, now approaching 70, had a right to know about their heritage, but they also deserved to have some control over how that information was shared with the world. Perhaps a private meeting could be arranged, allowing the family to gauge their wishes before deciding how to proceed. The Princess of Wales also suggested that they might need to consider the international implications of the revelation. The American diplomat involved in the affair had likely gone on to have a distinguished career, possibly even holding high office. His family and legacy could also be affected by the disclosure, and diplomatic relations between Britain and the United States might face strain if the revelation was not handled carefully. As their conversation continued into the evening, Catherine found herself taking on an increasingly advisory role. Her years of experience in managing public relations crises, combined with her intuitive understanding of public sentiment, made her a valuable sounding board for Charles's deliberations. She helped him think through various scenarios, from full disclosure to continued secrecy, weighing the potential consequences of each approach. The meeting concluded with an agreement that they would need to involve other key family members in the discussion, starting with William and potentially including other senior royals who would be affected by whatever decision was made. Catherine volunteered to help facilitate these conversations, recognizing that her role as a bridge between the older and younger generations of the royal family made her uniquely positioned to help navigate this crisis. As she drove back to Kensington Palace that night, Catherine knew that everything was about to change, and she steeled herself for the challenges that lay ahead. The following morning brought no relief from the storm of emotions that had engulfed Catherine since her meeting with King Charles. She had barely slept, her mind racing through the implications of what she had learned and the role she would need to play in the days ahead. As she sat in her private breakfast room at Kensington Palace, surrounded by the familiar comfort of family photos and children's artwork, the contrast between her normal life and the extraordinary situation she now faced felt almost surreal. William had left early for a series of engagements in Wales, and Catherine was grateful for the time alone to process everything before she would need to share this burden with her husband. She knew that the revelation about his grandmother would hit William particularly hard. His relationship with Queen Elizabeth had been one of the most stable and loving connections in his life, a source of strength during the difficult years following his mother's death. Learning that even she had harbored such profound secrets would shake his faith in everything he thought he understood about his family. Catherine's phone buzzed with a message from Charles's private secretary, informing her that the private investigator, James Morrison, would be available to meet with her that afternoon if she wished to review the evidence firsthand. The king had apparently decided that Catherine should have access to all the information before they proceeded with involving other family members. She appreciated his trust in her judgment, but the responsibility felt overwhelming. As she prepared for the day ahead, Catherine found herself thinking about the practical challenges that would emerge if this story became public. The royal family's carefully managed public image would be thrown into chaos, and every upcoming engagement would become an opportunity for journalists to ask uncomfortable questions. The children's schools would need to be briefed, security arrangements would need to be reviewed, and contingency plans would need to be developed for various scenarios. Catherine also considered the emotional toll this revelation would take on the extended royal family. Princess Anne, Prince Andrew, and Prince Edward would all need to be told about their mother's secret, and each would likely react differently to the news. Anne, known for her pragmatic approach to royal duties, might focus on damage control. Andrew, already dealing with his own controversies, might see this as either a distraction from his problems or an additional burden. Edward, the most private of the siblings, would probably struggle with the public attention that would inevitably follow. The meeting with James Morrison took place in a secure conference room at a discreet private club in central London. Catherine was struck by the investigator's professional demeanor and the obvious care he had taken to verify every piece of information before presenting it to the king. Morrison walked her through the timeline of events, starting with the state visit to America in 1953 and ending with the secret adoption arrangements made the following year. The evidence was more compelling than Catherine had expected. Morrison had obtained copies of medical records that had been thought destroyed, testimonies from former palace staff who were now in their 80s and 90s, and correspondence between senior government officials discussing the delicate situation that needed to be handled with utmost discretion. There were even photographs from the American state visit that, when viewed with knowledge of what transpired, showed subtle signs of the connection between Queen Elizabeth and the diplomat in question. Perhaps most poignant was a handwritten letter from Queen Elizabeth to her private secretary, written shortly after the birth, in which she expressed her anguish over the decision to give up the child but her firm belief that it was necessary for the stability of the monarchy. The letter revealed a side of the Queen that the public had never seen: vulnerable, heartbroken, but ultimately willing to sacrifice her personal happiness for what she saw as her duty to the nation. Catherine felt a deep sense of sadness as she absorbed these details. She thought about her own experience of motherhood, the powerful bond she had felt with each of her children from the moment they were born, and the unimaginable pain it would cause to give up a child. The Queen's sacrifice suddenly seemed even more profound than her decades of public service, because it was a loss that she had borne in complete silence for the rest of her life. Morrison also briefed Catherine on his attempts to locate the adopted child, now a 69-year-old retired teacher living in California. The investigation had identified the individual with reasonable certainty, but Morrison had not yet made contact, waiting for direction from the royal family on how to proceed. Catherine learned that the person in question had lived a completely ordinary middle-class American life, married with 3 adult children and several grandchildren, and had no apparent knowledge of their royal heritage. The investigator raised an important point about timing. He had detected signs that other parties might be pursuing similar lines of inquiry, possibly including foreign intelligence services and investigative journalists. While he couldn't be certain, Morrison estimated that the royal family might have only a few months before someone else uncovered the same information and potentially published it without any consideration for the family's wishes or the privacy of the individuals involved. Catherine asked Morrison about the potential legal implications of the revelation. Could the adopted child make any claim to royal titles or succession rights? Morrison explained that the laws governing succession had been changed multiple times since 1954, and that an illegitimate child born to a reigning monarch would have no legal standing in the line of succession. However, the symbolic impact would be enormous. and there could be complicated questions about whether the child should be acknowledged publicly as a member of the extended royal family. As the meeting concluded, Catherine felt the full weight of the decision that lay ahead. She and Charles would need to determine not only whether to reveal this secret, but also how to do so in a way that minimized harm to all parties involved. The adopted child and their family deserved consideration. The British public deserved honesty from their royal family, and the monarchy itself needed to survive this revelation with its credibility intact. Catherine spent the remainder of the afternoon developing a framework for discussing the situation with William and the other senior royals. She realized that they would need to approach this systematically, considering not just the immediate emotional impact, but also the long-term consequences for the institution they all served. The conversation would need to address questions of ethics, public relations, legal implications, and family dynamics all at once. That evening, as Catherine put her children to bed, she found herself looking at them with new eyes. George, Charlotte, and Louis were growing up in a world where the royal family was expected to be more transparent and accountable than ever before. Perhaps this crisis, difficult as it would be to navigate, could ultimately strengthen the monarchy by demonstrating that even royals were human beings capable of love, loss, and difficult choices. Catherine made a mental note to call her own parents before the story broke, knowing that they would need time to prepare for the inevitable media attention that would come their way. The Middleton family had already experienced intense scrutiny when Catherine married William, but this would be on an entirely different scale. Every aspect of their lives would be examined for clues about how they had influenced Catherine's handling of the crisis. As she finally settled into bed that night, Catherine felt a strange mixture of anxiety and determination. The next few days would test everything she had learned about royal duty, public service, and family loyalty. But she also felt a sense of purpose, knowing that her unique position within the family gave her an opportunity to help navigate this crisis in a way that honored both the memory of Queen Elizabeth and the needs of the living family members who would have to deal with the consequences of her long-ago decision. William arrived home from Wales that evening to find Catherine waiting for him in their private sitting room, her expression immediately telling him that something serious had occurred in his absence. She had spent hours thinking about how to approach this conversation, knowing that the revelation would fundamentally change William's understanding of his family history and potentially challenge his deepest beliefs about the grandmother he had adored. Catherine began gently, explaining that his father had made an important discovery that would affect the entire family. As she recounted the details of King Charles's investigation and the shocking findings about Queen Elizabeth's secret, William's reaction progressed through disbelief, confusion, and finally a profound sadness that Catherine had rarely seen in her husband. The man who had learned to maintain his composure in the most challenging public situations found himself struggling to process this private devastation. William's first instinct was to reject the information entirely. The grandmother he remembered had been the epitome of moral strength and unwavering dedication to duty. She had been his anchor during the turbulent years of his parents' divorce and his mother's death, providing stability and wisdom when his world felt like it was falling apart. The idea that she had kept such an enormous secret seemed to contradict everything he believed about her character and their relationship. As Catherine patiently walked him through the evidence, including the documents and testimonies that Morrison had uncovered, William began to grapple with the complexity of the situation. He found himself torn between feeling betrayed by his grandmother's secrecy and developing a new understanding of the pressures she had faced as a young monarch. The queen he had known in his adult years had been shaped by decades of experience and the wisdom that came with age. But in 1953, she had been only slightly older than he was now, facing impossible choices with limited guidance. William's thoughts turned immediately to his own children and how this revelation would affect them. George, as the future king, would eventually need to understand the full complexity of royal history, including its darker chapters. Charlotte and Louis would grow up knowing that their great-grandmother, whom they remembered with such fondness, had lived a life far more complicated than the public ever knew. William worried about how to preserve their innocent memories while also preparing them for the scrutiny that would inevitably come. The Prince of Wales also considered the impact on his relationship with his father. Charles had clearly agonized over whether to share this burden, and William recognized the trust that had been placed in him and Catherine. At the same time, he felt a new understanding of the weight that Charles had been carrying since becoming king, and the impossible decisions that came with leading an institution built on tradition, while navigating the demands of modern transparency. Catherine suggested that they needed to think strategically about how to proceed, and William agreed to join the planned meeting with other senior family members. However, he insisted on speaking with his father privately first, needing to work through his own emotions before contributing to broader family discussions. The conversation with Charles, held the following morning at Clarence's house, proved to be one of the most honest and emotionally raw exchanges the two men had ever shared. Charles explained his decision-making process in detail, including his initial reluctance to pursue the investigation and his growing certainty that the truth would eventually emerge with or without their involvement. He shared his own struggle to reconcile the mother he had known with the young woman who had made such a desperate choice 70 years earlier. Father and son found themselves bonding over their shared sense of loss, not just for Queen Elizabeth herself, but for the simpler understanding of their family history that could never be recovered. William raised the question that had been troubling him most: whether they had a moral obligation to contact the unknown half-sibling before making any public announcements. Both men agreed that this person deserved to learn about their heritage from the family rather than from newspaper headlines, but they also recognized the enormous disruption this would cause to someone who had lived their entire life believing a completely different story about their origins. The conversation also touched on the broader implications for the monarchy's future. William had been working for years to modernize the institution and make it more relevant to younger generations who valued authenticity and transparency. While this revelation would undoubtedly cause short-term damage, it might ultimately strengthen the royal family's connection with the public by demonstrating that even monarchs were human beings who faced difficult personal choices. Charles and William spent considerable time discussing the timing of any potential disclosure. Morrison's warning about other parties pursuing similar investigations meant that they might not have the luxury of taking months to decide. At the same time, rushing into a public announcement without careful preparation could make the situation worse. They agreed that Catherine's suggestion to involve other senior family members was crucial, as the decision would affect everyone and needed broad support to be successful. The meeting concluded with an agreement to convene a family conference within the next few days, including Princess Anne, Prince Edward, and potentially Prince Andrew, depending on the sensitivity of the discussions. William also suggested involving Camilla, recognizing that as Queen Consort, she would play a crucial role in managing the public response and supporting Charles through what would undoubtedly be one of the most challenging periods of his reign. That afternoon, William and Catherine took a long walk through the grounds of Kensington Palace, using the privacy of the enclosed gardens to continue processing the implications of what they had learned. Catherine shared her growing conviction that the family's response to this crisis could define their legacy for generations to come. If they handled it with grace, honesty, and consideration for all parties involved, it could demonstrate the royal family's evolution into a more open and relatable institution. William found himself thinking about his mother, Diana, and how she might have reacted to this revelation. Diana had always pushed for greater transparency and emotional honesty within the royal family, often clashing with more traditional members who preferred to maintain strict privacy about personal matters. In some ways, the decision to acknowledge Queen Elizabeth's secret would honor Diana's legacy of bringing more humanity to the monarchy. The couple also discussed the practical challenges they would face in the coming weeks. Their public engagements would need to be carefully managed, their staff would need to be briefed on potential media inquiries, and contingency plans would need to be developed for various scenarios. Catherine's experience in crisis management would be invaluable, but they both recognized that this situation was unlike anything they had previously encountered. As evening approached, William and Catherine returned to their normal routine of dinner with the children and bedtime stories, finding comfort in the familiar rituals of family life. However, both were acutely aware that their lives were about to change dramatically. The next few weeks would test everything they had learned about royal duty, public service, and family loyalty. but they felt strengthened by their united approach to the challenge ahead. William called his father that night to confirm his participation in the upcoming family meeting and to express his support for whatever decision they reached collectively. Despite his initial shock and confusion, he had come to understand that some secrets were too important to remain buried, and that the royal family's credibility might actually depend on their willingness to acknowledge the complexities of their history. The conversation ended with both men feeling more confident about their ability to navigate the crisis together, drawing strength from their shared commitment to protecting the monarchy, while honoring the truth about its past. The emergency family meeting was convened 3 days later in the Oak Room at Windsor Castle, a setting chosen for its privacy and historical significance. Princess Anne arrived first, her characteristic directness evident as she immediately asked Charles to explain why such urgent secrecy was necessary. Prince Edward followed shortly after, accompanied by his wife Sophie, who had been included due to her experience in public relations and crisis management. Prince Andrew had been deliberately excluded from this initial discussion, with the family agreeing that his own ongoing controversies made him a liability in such a sensitive situation. Catherine and William entered together, and Catherine could immediately sense the tension in the room. Each family member was clearly wondering what crisis could be significant enough to warrant such an unprecedented gathering. Charles had requested that all attendees surrender their mobile phones to ensure complete privacy, and the presence of additional security measures made it clear that whatever was about to be discussed was of the highest sensitivity. Charles began by explaining the circumstances that had led to the private investigation, including the anonymous letters and his growing concern that family secrets might be exploited by hostile parties. As he began to reveal the findings about Queen Elizabeth's hidden past, Catherine watched the faces of the senior royals carefully, noting their varying reactions to each new piece of information. Princess Anne's response was perhaps the most measured. As someone who had worked closely with her mother for decades and understood the pressures of royal life better than most, she seemed less shocked by the revelation than by the practical implications of its potential disclosure. Anne immediately began asking practical questions about the evidence, the reliability of the sources, and the likelihood that other parties might uncover the same information independently. Prince Edward's reaction was more emotional. Like William, he struggled to reconcile this new information with his memories of his mother as a figure of unshakable moral authority. However, his experience in television production had given him insights into public relations and media management that proved valuable as the discussion progressed. Edward raised important questions about how the story might be perceived by different segments of the public and what narrative strategies might help minimize damage to the monarchy's reputation. Sophie's contribution proved particularly valuable, as her background in public relations provided a professional perspective on crisis management. She outlined several potential scenarios for how the information might become public, ranging from controlled disclosure by the family to unauthorized leaks by journalists or foreign intelligence services. Sophie also raised the crucial point that the family's response time was limited, as delays in decision-making could be seen as indecisiveness or guilt. Catherine found herself taking on an increasingly central role in the discussion, serving as a bridge between the older and younger generations of royals. Her outsider's perspective allowed her to anticipate how the public might react to various approaches, while her experience with media management provided practical insights into how to control the narrative. She emphasized the importance of considering the welfare of the unknown half-sibling and their family, arguing that any disclosure needed to prioritize their privacy and dignity. The family spent considerable time debating whether to attempt contact with the half-sibling before making any public announcements. Anne argued strongly that this person deserved to learn about their heritage from the family, rather than from newspaper headlines, while Edward worried about the legal and security implications of making contact with someone whose reaction they couldn't predict. Catherine suggested that a carefully managed approach through intermediaries might allow them to gauge the person's wishes without immediately revealing the full scope of the situation. William raised the question of timing, pointing out that Morrison's warnings about other investigations meant they might have only weeks or months before someone else broke the story. The family agreed that waiting too long could result in losing control of the narrative entirely, But rushing into disclosure without adequate preparation could make the situation worse. They settled on a timeline that would allow for careful planning, while still moving quickly enough to stay ahead of potential leaks. The discussion also touched on the broader question of what this revelation meant for the monarchy's future. Charles spoke passionately about his vision of a more transparent and accountable royal family, arguing that acknowledging difficult truths from the past could ultimately strengthen the institution's credibility with younger generations. Anne was more skeptical, worrying that opening the door to scrutiny of historical secrets could lead to endless investigations and revelations that would destabilize the monarchy. Catherine made a compelling argument that the royal family's response to this crisis could serve as a template for how they handled future challenges. If they approached the situation with honesty, dignity, and consideration for all parties involved, it could demonstrate their evolution into a more modern and relatable institution. However, if they appeared to be hiding information or protecting themselves at the expense of others, it could reinforce negative stereotypes about royal privilege and secrecy. The meeting concluded with an agreement to proceed with a carefully planned disclosure strategy, beginning with an attempt to contact the half-sibling through appropriate intermediaries. The family would work with Morrison to develop a communication plan that respected everyone's privacy, while ensuring that the truth emerged in a controlled manner. They also agreed to engage professional crisis management experts to help coordinate their response and prepare for the intense media scrutiny that would inevitably follow. As the family members prepared to leave, Charles asked Catherine to remain behind for a private conversation. He expressed his gratitude for her contributions to the discussion and asked if she would be willing to take a leading role in coordinating the family's response. Catherine accepted the responsibility, recognizing that her unique position within the family and her experience with public relations made her well-suited for the challenge. The drive back to Kensington Palace gave Catherine and William time to decompress and discuss their impressions of the meeting. Both felt optimistic about the family's ability to handle the crisis effectively, but they also recognized the enormous challenges that lay ahead. The next few weeks would require careful coordination, delicate diplomacy, and a level of transparency that the royal family had rarely attempted in such sensitive circumstances. That evening, Catherine began working on a detailed action plan that would guide the family's response over the coming weeks. The plan included timelines for contacting the half-sibling, strategies for managing media coverage, protocols for briefing government officials, and contingency plans for various scenarios. She also began assembling a team of trusted advisors who could provide expertise in areas ranging from genealogy to international relations. As she worked late into the night, Catherine reflected on how much her role within the royal family had evolved since her marriage to William. What had begun as a personal journey of adaptation to royal life had become a position of genuine influence and responsibility. The decisions she helped make in the coming weeks would affect not only her own family, but the institution of monarchy itself. Catherine felt a deep sense of responsibility as she considered the task ahead. The revelation about Queen Elizabeth's secret would test everything the royal family claimed to represent, but it also offered an opportunity to demonstrate their commitment to truth, dignity, and service. If they could navigate this crisis successfully, it might mark a turning point in the monarchy's relationship with the British people and the world. 2 weeks after the family meeting, Catherine found herself on a secure video call with Dr. Margaret Chen, a retired psychiatrist and specialist in family reunification, who had been carefully vetted to serve as an intermediary in contacting Queen Elizabeth's unknown child. The process of reaching out had required extensive planning, with legal experts, security professionals, and diplomatic advisors all weighing in on the most appropriate approach. Dr. Chen had successfully made initial contact with the individual, a woman named Patricia Harrison, who lived in a comfortable suburban home in Pasadena, California. Patricia was a retired high school English teacher, widowed for 5 years with 3 adult children and 6 grandchildren. According to Dr. Chen's initial assessment, Patricia was a thoughtful, well-educated woman who had always known she was adopted but had never felt compelled to search for her birth parents. The initial conversation had been carefully scripted to avoid revealing the full scope of Patricia's heritage while gauging her interest in learning more about her Background: Dr. Chen had presented herself as representing a family genealogy research project and had asked Patricia whether she would be interested in participating in discussions about her family history. Patricia had expressed curiosity but also some wariness, particularly when Dr. Chen mentioned that the information involved prominent historical figures. Catherine listened intently as Dr. Chen described Patricia's living situation and emotional state. The woman lived independently, but maintained close relationships with her children, who visited regularly and included her in family gatherings and holidays. Her late husband had been a respected engineer, and they had enjoyed a comfortable middle-class lifestyle throughout their 40-year marriage. Patricia was active in her local community, volunteering at the library, and participating in a book club that had been meeting for over 2 decades. The delicate nature of the revelation became apparent as Dr. Chen explained Patricia's family dynamics. Her eldest son, David, was a successful attorney in Los Angeles who was currently considering a run for local political office. Her daughter, Susan, was a pediatric nurse with 2 young children who would likely face intense scrutiny if their grandmother's royal heritage became public knowledge. Her youngest son, Michael, worked as a software engineer in Silicon Valley and valued his privacy above almost everything else. Catherine felt a deep sense of responsibility as she considered how the revelation would affect not just Patricia, but her entire extended family. These were ordinary people who had built their lives around normal expectations of privacy and security. The discovery of their royal connection would thrust them into a spotlight they had never sought and potentially disrupt the peaceful lives they had worked hard to create. Dr. Chen recommended a gradual approach to revealing the truth, beginning with general information about Patricia's birth parents and slowly building toward the full revelation of her royal heritage. The psychiatrist emphasized that Patricia would need time to process each piece of information, and that rushing the disclosure could cause psychological harm. Catherine agreed to this approach, despite the family's concern about timing and the possibility of the story breaking before Patricia could be properly prepared. The video call concluded with plans for Dr. Chen to have a second conversation with Patricia the following week, during which she would reveal that Patricia's birth mother had been a member of the British royal family. The specific identity would be withheld until Patricia had time to absorb this initial shock and decide whether she wanted to learn more details. Catherine would be available for consultation throughout the process, but direct contact between the royal family and Patricia would wait until she explicitly requested it. Meanwhile, Catherine was coordinating preparations for the eventual public disclosure with a team of crisis management experts led by Sir David Maxwell, a former government communications director with extensive experience in handling sensitive political situations. Maxwell had assembled a comprehensive strategy that included coordinated statements from Buckingham Palace, Kensington Palace, and the governments of both the United Kingdom and the United States. The team had also been working closely with editors at major British newspapers to ensure that when the story broke, it would be reported with appropriate sensitivity and accuracy, rather than allowing the information to leak through uncontrolled channels. The royal family had decided to provide exclusive access to carefully selected journalists who had demonstrated responsibility in covering royal stories in the past. This approach would help ensure that Patricia's privacy was protected and that the story focused on the historical rather than sensational aspects of the revelation. Catherine had also been working with William to prepare their children for the upcoming changes to their family's public profile. George, at 11 years old, was deemed old enough to understand the basic facts about his great-grandmother's secret, though the full complexity of the situation would be revealed gradually as he matured. Charlotte and Louis would be told a simplified version appropriate to their ages, with the understanding that they would learn more details as they grew older. The preparation process had also involved extensive consultations with government officials, including the Prime Minister's office and the Foreign Secretary. The revelation had potential implications for British-American relations, particularly if the American diplomat involved in the affair had gone on to hold senior positions in government. Diplomatic channels were being used to discreetly research the diplomat's career and family situation to minimize potential embarrassment or conflict. Security arrangements were also being enhanced around all senior royal family members, with particular attention to Catherine and William's children. Intelligence services had briefed the family on potential threats from hostile foreign governments who might try to exploit the revelation for propaganda purposes. Additional protection officers had been assigned, and contingency plans had been developed for various scenarios ranging from peaceful public interest to more aggressive attempts at exploitation. Catherine found herself reflecting on how the situation demonstrated the complexity of modern royal life. Every personal decision had public implications. Every family secret had the potential to become an international incident, and every attempt at transparency had to be balanced against considerations of privacy, security, and diplomatic relations. The weight of these responsibilities was enormous, but Catherine also felt a sense of purpose in helping to navigate such a significant historical moment. As the second week of preparations concluded, Catherine received word that Patricia Harrison had agreed to Dr. Chen's proposal for a follow-up conversation. The retired teacher had spent the intervening days researching adoption procedures from the 1950s and had begun to piece together some of the timeline that Dr. Chen had outlined. Patricia had also confided in her eldest son, David, who had advised caution but had also expressed curiosity about their family's hidden history. Catherine felt a mixture of anticipation and anxiety as she prepared for the next phase of the process. Once Patricia learned about her royal heritage, there would be no turning back. The revelation would change not only Patricia's understanding of her own identity, but potentially the course of the British monarchy's relationship with the public. The success or failure of the next few conversations would determine whether this crisis became a disaster or an opportunity for positive change. The evening before Dr. Chen's second call with Patricia,
Catherine spent time with her own children,
reading bedtime stories and helping with homework, finding comfort in the normal routines of family life. As she tucked Charlotte into bed, her daughter asked innocently whether they would always live at Kensington Palace. Catherine realized that her children's future would be shaped by the decisions being made in these crucial weeks, and she felt the full weight of responsibility for getting this right. The moment Catherine had been dreading and anticipating finally arrived on a crisp October morning when Dr. Chen called to report that Patricia Harrison had reacted to the revelation about her royal heritage with remarkable composure. After the initial shock had worn off, Patricia had spent 2 days in quiet reflection before requesting a direct conversation with someone from the royal family. She had specifically asked to speak with Catherine, having researched the Princess of Wales online and feeling that a fellow mother might understand her complicated emotions about learning such life-changing information at the age of 69. Catherine prepared meticulously for the video call with Patricia, consulting with counselors about the psychological impact of late-life identity revelations and working with security experts to ensure the conversation remained private. When they finally connected across the Atlantic, Catherine was struck by Patricia's dignified bearing and the intelligent curiosity in her eyes. The retired teacher possessed a natural elegance that seemed to hint at her royal genetics, though she had lived her entire life unaware of her extraordinary heritage. Patricia's first words were not about herself, but about Queen Elizabeth, expressing sympathy for the impossible choice a young monarch had faced in giving up her child. This compassion immediately endeared her to Catherine, who recognized in Patricia the same sense of duty and consideration for others that had characterized the late queen. Patricia explained that she had always felt different from her adoptive family, not in any negative way, but with interests and instincts that seemed to come from somewhere else entirely. The conversation revealed that Patricia had unknowingly developed many of the same passions that had defined Queen Elizabeth's life. She was an accomplished equestrian who had competed in dressage events throughout her adult life. She had a deep knowledge of British history and literature, and she possessed an intuitive understanding of protocol and etiquette that had served her well in her teaching career. Most remarkably, she had always felt a strong connection to the British royal family, following their activities closely and traveling to London multiple times to witness historic events. Catherine was deeply moved as Patricia shared memories of watching Queen Elizabeth's funeral on television, feeling an inexplicable sense of personal loss that had surprised her family. Patricia had even traveled to London for the Queen's Platinum Jubilee celebrations, standing among the crowds outside Buckingham Palace and feeling an overwhelming emotion that she had never been able to explain. Learning that this had been her final opportunity to see her birth mother, albeit from a distance, brought tears to both women's eyes. Patricia's practical concerns were as thoughtful as her emotional responses. She worried about the impact on her children and grandchildren, who had built their lives around the assumption that they were ordinary middle-class Americans. Her son David's political aspirations would be complicated by the revelation, while her daughter Susan feared the attention that would inevitably focus on her young children. Patricia had already begun consulting with a lawyer about protecting her family's privacy and considering whether they should move to avoid media harassment. The conversation also touched on Patricia's relationship with her adoptive parents, both long deceased, and her gratitude for the loving home they had provided. She emphasized that learning about her royal heritage did not diminish her appreciation for the family that had raised her, but it did help explain certain aspects of her personality and interests that had always seemed mysterious. Patricia expressed no desire for royal titles or official recognition, but she did hope for the opportunity to learn more about Queen Elizabeth's life and perhaps visit some of the places that had been important to her birth mother. Catherine was impressed by Patricia's emotional maturity and her instinctive understanding of the complexities involved in acknowledging her heritage publicly. When Catherine explained the royal family's plans for a controlled disclosure of the story, Patricia immediately grasped the strategic considerations and offered to cooperate fully with whatever approach would best serve everyone's interests. She even suggested ways to frame the narrative that would emphasize Queen Elizabeth's sacrifice and humanity, rather than focusing on scandal or impropriety. The most touching moment of the conversation came when Patricia asked whether she could see photographs of Queen Elizabeth as a young woman, particularly from around the time of her birth. Catherine had anticipated this request and had prepared a carefully curated collection of images, including some that had never been released publicly. As Patricia viewed these photos, she remarked on certain facial features and expressions that she recognized in her own children and grandchildren, finally understanding the source of family traits that had always been attributed to unknown genetics. Patricia also shared her own family photographs, allowing Catherine to see clear evidence of the royal bloodline in Patricia's descendants. Her daughter Susan bore a particularly striking resemblance to Princess Anne at the same age, while her grandson showed facial features that were remarkably similar to those of young Prince William. These visual confirmations made the genetic connection undeniable and added another layer of complexity to the decisions facing both families. As their conversation continued, Catherine found herself developing genuine affection and respect for this remarkable woman who had lived such an extraordinary life without ever knowing her true heritage. Patricia's grace under pressure, her consideration for others, and her instinctive understanding of duty marked her unmistakably as Queen Elizabeth's daughter, even though they had never met. Catherine realized that Patricia would have been a worthy addition to the royal family under different circumstances, and she felt sadness for the relationship that had been sacrificed to protect the monarchy. The call concluded with agreements on next steps, including Patricia's consent to participate in the planned public disclosure and her request for a private meeting with King Charles before any announcements were made. Patricia wanted to thank him personally for handling the situation with such care, and to assure him that she harbored no resentment toward the royal family for the circumstances of her birth and adoption. She understood that Queen Elizabeth had made the only choice available to her at the time, and respected the sacrifice that had enabled Patricia to live a happy, normal life. Catherine immediately called Charles to brief him on the conversation and arrange for the requested meeting. The king was deeply moved by Patricia's response and agreed to travel to California for a private encounter before the public announcement. This meeting would mark the first time in 70 years that Queen Elizabeth's secret child would have contact with her birth family, a moment that would be both healing and heartbreaking for everyone involved. As Catherine prepared for the final phase of the disclosure process, she reflected on how Patricia Harrison's remarkable grace had transformed what could have been a devastating scandal into an opportunity for the royal family to demonstrate their humanity and growth. The retired teacher's dignity and wisdom had shown that Queen Elizabeth's sacrifice had indeed protected something precious, not just the monarchy, but the chance for her daughter to live a full, meaningful life free from the burdens of royal duty. The story would soon become public, but Catherine felt confident that Patricia's involvement would help ensure that it was told with the respect and sensitivity that all parties deserved. Queen Elizabeth's final secret was about to be revealed, but it would be shared in a way that honored both the sacrifice she had made and the extraordinary woman who had unknowingly carried her legacy forward through 7 decades of ordinary, extraordinary life.